Inside ADX Florence, America's most secure supermax prison, the birth of a fortress. In the closing years of the 1980s, the American federal prison system was on the brink of collapse. The nation had entered a new era of violence, one where organized gangs, extremist groups, and domestic terrorists began turning federal penitentiaries into breeding grounds for rebellion. Inside prisons like Leavenworth, Atlanta, and especially Marion in Illinois, chaos had replaced control. Guards were ambushed, inmates were assassinated, and order seemed like an impossible dream. The tipping point came on October 22, 1983, at USP Marion, then considered the highest security federal prison in the country. Two correctional officers, Merle Klutz and Robert Hoffman, were murdered within hours of each other by inmates belonging to the Aryan Brotherhood. The killings were deliberate, coordinated, and symbolically executed on the same day. The message to federal authorities was unmistakable. The prison system had lost control of its most dangerous men. The murders at Marion changed everything. The facility went into permanent lockdown, a drastic measure meant to suppress further violence. For the next 2 decades, inmates at Marion lived in 23-hour-a-day solitary confinement. The Bureau of Prisons, BOP, had stumbled onto a grim experiment in human control, and it worked. Violence dropped sharply, but the cost was psychological devastation. Still, Washington saw results. The message spread through the halls of the Justice Department. We can contain anyone if we control everything. That idea became the seed from which ADX Florence would grow. The early 1990s brought more chaos to the system. The crack cocaine epidemic had filled federal prisons to capacity. The rise of transnational gangs, the Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, the Black Guerrilla family, transformed ordinary penitentiaries into battlefields. Inside those walls, crime didn't stop, it evolved. Gang leaders used coded letters, corrupt guards, and even lawyers to run entire criminal enterprises from behind bars. The Bureau of Prisons faced a nightmare. Men who were supposed to be caged were still commanding soldiers in the streets. At the same time, terrorism was emerging as a new national fear. The 1993 World Trade Center bombing shocked America into realizing that extremists could strike anywhere, even from inside its own borders. When intelligence agencies warned that some inmates were attempting to radicalize others from within federal prisons, it became clear that isolation alone wasn't enough. The government needed a facility that didn't just imprison, it erased influence altogether. Thus began the planning of a prison unlike any before it, a fortress built to hold men who could not be controlled by any other means. In 1989, the Bureau of Prisons selected a desolate piece of land 2 miles south of Florence, Colorado, surrounded by mountains, dust, and silence. The location was perfect, remote, easily secured, and already home to 3 other correctional facilities. Local residents were told the new institution would bring jobs and federal funding. Few realized that the most feared men in the world would soon live just miles away. Construction started quietly. The design team studied every major security failure in U.S. prison history. They analyzed how inmates communicated, how riots began, how weapons were smuggled, and how guards were ambushed. Every lesson was translated into architecture. By 1994, the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, ADX Florence, was completed at a cost of $60 million. Federal officials called it the ultimate control environment. Critics would soon call it something else, the clean version of hell. From the moment it opened, ADX was destined to become the end of the line, a place for the worst of the worst. It wasn't just about who a man was or what crime he had committed. It was about what he had done after being imprisoned, the murders, the uprisings, the manipulation. ADX was not meant for criminals who broke the law, but for those who broke the system itself. Every detail of the prison's design spoke of that purpose. The walls were poured concrete reinforced with steel mesh. The cell doors were operated electronically from a secure control room. Windows were only 4 inches wide, angled upward so that no inmate could see another human being or the surrounding landscape. Inside the cells, furniture was molded from concrete: a bed, desk, stool, and shelf, impossible to dismantle or weaponize. Even the plumbing was designed to prevent flooding or communication through pipes. Surrounding the main housing units was a labyrinth of motion detectors, laser sensors, and armed patrols. The outer perimeter, a double fence topped with razor wire and monitored by cameras, was backed by an electronic detection system sensitive enough to detect a rabbit crossing at night. Overhead, floodlights illuminated the compound every hour of the day. The design eliminated blind spots, reducing the need for physical confrontation between staff and inmates. The guiding philosophy was sight without contact, control without confrontation. The Bureau of Prisons made its intentions clear. This facility was built for the men who kill in silence, organize in isolation, and never stop commanding power. When ADX opened in November 1994, it immediately drew national attention. The media compared it to Alcatraz, but ADX was something far beyond that. Alcatraz relied on geography, an island surrounded by icy water. ADX relied on engineering and psychology. A former warden once said, "It's not the place that holds them, it's the design that breaks them." Within months, the Bureau began transferring its most notorious inmates there. Thomas Silverstein, the Aryan Brotherhood leader responsible for the Marion murders, became one of the first residents. Others soon followed: gang bosses, convicted bombers, and inmates who had killed guards or fellow prisoners in other facilities. For them, ADX was not just a prison. It was the final stop in the American penal hierarchy. There was nowhere else to go after Florence. The timing of ADX's rise coincided with a broader political shift in America. The tough-on-crime era of the 1990s demanded harsh sentences, zero tolerance, and maximum security. Supermax prisons began appearing across states: California's Pelican Bay, Virginia's Red Onion, Illinois' Tams, all modeled after Florence's isolation-based design. But ADX stood apart. It wasn't a state experiment. It was the federal government's ultimate statement of power. Prison architects and psychologists who studied the design noted that it applied the principles of total sensory control. The environment itself became the warden. The architecture didn't just contain violence. It shaped behavior through deprivation. Inmates deprived of human contact grew dependent on routine. Time ceased to flow normally. Days blurred into years. Silence became both punishment and power. To its supporters, ADX was a triumph of modern corrections, a place where the most dangerous men could no longer threaten anyone. To its critics, it was the physical manifestation of fear, a prison built not for justice, but for vengeance. Even before its first decade ended, the stories began leaking out. Former guards described the eerie quiet, the absence of human voices, the way footsteps echoed down endless corridors. Psychologists warned that long-term isolation would destroy minds. Yet for federal officials, the measure of success was simple: no riots, no escapes, no dead officers. By that metric, ADX Florence was perfect. But beneath the surface of that perfection lay an uncomfortable truth. By replacing violence with silence, the Bureau of Prisons had created something far more enduring: an institution where men did not fight each other because they no longer remembered how to be human. In the following years, ADX would become home to terrorists, spies, and cartel leaders whose names defined entire decades of fear. From Timothy McVeigh to Ted Kaczynski, from foreign bombers to domestic radicals, the fortress in Colorado would stand as both symbol and sentence, the place where America's darkest stories would end. As one federal prosecutor put it during a sentencing hearing in 1998, "Florence is where the light goes out on evil." And yet, for those who built it, the question would linger: had they truly built a monument to safety or a monument to despair? The silence of Florence, vast and unbroken, would answer that question in time. The blueprint of control. The story of ADX Florence is not just about prisoners, it's about design. Every inch of the facility was built with a single purpose: to control the human being completely. When the Bureau of Prisons commissioned its construction in 1989, it wasn't hiring ordinary architects. It recruited designers who understood not only concrete and steel, but also human behavior. ADX was to be a place where architecture itself enforced discipline, where walls and light replaced the baton and the gun. The guiding principle behind the blueprint was simple: eliminate every possible variable that could cause disruption. The designers studied every riot in federal prison history, every escape, every staff assault, every coded message that ever left a cell. They took notes on how inmates communicated, how they smuggled contraband, and how they organized violence through the smallest openings in the system. Then, they built a structure where none of those openings existed. A fortress by design. The site, chosen in Florence, Colorado, lies over 5,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by arid plains and jagged mountains. The land itself seemed lifeless: no forests to hide in, no rivers to cross, only miles of wind and dust. It was isolation by geography before a single wall went up. The prison was designed as a layered fortress. At its core lies the control unit, surrounded by multiple rings of security: razor wire fences, motion detectors, pressure sensors, and armed towers. From the air, ADX looks like a geometric scar on the desert, a cross-shaped layout of housing units radiating from a central command hub, each wing separated by concrete barriers and surveillance corridors. At the heart of that hub sits the electronic control center, the brain of the entire facility. From there, officers can open and close every door, monitor every cell, and track every movement within seconds. Cameras cover nearly every angle of the prison, more than 1,400 in total, each streaming to monitors that never go dark. Former Warden Robert Hood once explained, "A prisoner can't take 2 steps without being recorded. There's no dark corner, no blind spot. It's total visibility, but only one way. We see them, they never see us." Every detail is meant to strip away unpredictability. The walls, 12 inches thick, are reinforced with steel mesh. Windows are made of shatterproof glass, just 4 inches wide and angled so that even standing on the concrete bed, an inmate can see nothing beyond a sliver of the sky. There are no glimpses of mountains, no sense of direction. North, south, east, and west dissolve into uniform gray. Each cell is self-contained: a bed molded from concrete, a small desk, a stainless steel toilet and sink, a shower with an automatic timer, and a concrete stool bolted to the floor. There are no bars, only solid steel doors with narrow slots that open mechanically for meals. Inside, light is constant: white fluorescence by day, dimmed at night, but never extinguished. The air is filtered, the temperature regulated, the environment perfectly predictable. If a man screams, the sound dies in his own concrete box. If he whispers, the microphones hear him. The facility was engineered around a principle corrections officials call direct control architecture. In older prisons, inmates could move between areas under supervision: cafeterias, recreation yards, classrooms, workshops. At ADX, movement barely exists. The environment eliminates the need for direct confrontation between inmates and staff. The fewer interactions there are, the fewer opportunities for violence. Every door in the prison can be opened remotely from a secure control room. Officers rarely come within arm's reach of a prisoner. Even during transfers between cells or to the recreation area, inmates are placed in full restraints: handcuffs, waist chains, and leg shackles, escorted by at least 3 guards. Every escort route is cleared in advance, ensuring no 2 inmates ever cross paths. Isolation as architecture. The architecture itself imposes isolation as a behavioral condition. The absence of sound, movement, and visual variety changes how time passes. For inmates, days merge into one another until memory itself becomes unreliable. A former ADX psychologist once explained, "The building doesn't just confine them, it teaches them what it means to be alone." You can't measure time without change, and in there, nothing changes. Even the airflow is controlled to prevent inmates from speaking through vents, a method used in other prisons to communicate between cells. Each unit has its own sealed ventilation system. The design ensures that no 2 prisoners can hear each other's voices. To the Bureau of Prisons, this was progress: total security through environmental engineering. To critics, it was the first instance in modern America where architecture was used as a tool of psychological warfare. The ADX complex itself contains several units, each designed for different levels of control. General population units, where inmates begin their term at ADX under high surveillance. Intermediate units, for those demonstrating consistent compliance. Special housing units, SHU, used for disciplinary isolation. H unit, Bombers Row, where high-profile terrorists are held under special administrative measures, SAMs. Control unit, the heart of the prison, reserved for inmates deemed most dangerous or influential. Each unit functions like a world unto itself: separate corridors, isolated recreation pens, and limited staff rotation to minimize the risk of familiarity or manipulation. The routine of control, a typical day at ADX, unfolds with mechanical precision. At 4 a.m., lights rise to full brightness. At 5 o'clock, breakfast arrives. Plastic trays pass through metal slots by guards who never speak. Meals last 15 minutes. From 6 a.m. to 10 a.m., inmates are confined to their cells for in-cell programming, reading, writing, or watching tightly monitored television channels. Educational programs, when available, are broadcast via closed-circuit systems. No interaction, no teacher, no classroom. Around 10:30 a.m., certain inmates are escorted, one by one, to the recreation pens, concrete enclosures slightly larger than their cells, surrounded by high walls and a metal mesh roof. There is no grass, no open view, just a sliver of sunlight filtered through steel. They have 1 hour. Some exercise. Others stand and stare upward. Many simply pace in circles. Lunch is served at 12 p.m., dinner at 5 p.m., and lights dim at 10 p.m. But darkness never truly arrives. The low hum of fluorescent glow remains, a permanent reminder that sleep is monitored. Each movement, each sound, each human action is recorded in the logbooks. Inmates cannot see clocks, cannot tell how long they've been awake or how much time has passed. Guards, behind reinforced glass and surveillance cameras, know every detail. The system creates an imbalance of knowledge so absolute that resistance becomes meaningless. The psychological engineering. The psychological theory behind ADX comes from the concept of learned helplessness, developed by psychologist Martin Seligman in the 1960s. The idea, when a person realizes they cannot control their environment, they eventually stop trying. The Bureau of Prisons applied that principle to high-risk management. If a man can't manipulate, organize, or resist, if every possible outcome is predetermined by the system, then he will eventually comply. In practice, the result is obedience through exhaustion. Inmates who once led gangs or coordinated attacks lose the ability to strategize when every aspect of existence is controlled by a machine-like system. The only choices left are internal: what to think, what to remember, what to feel. This psychological strategy extends even to the staff. Officers are trained to minimize emotional reactions, using neutral tones and scripted communication. Smiling, casual talk, or gestures of familiarity are discouraged. The idea is to prevent any emotional bond between staff and inmate, a safeguard against manipulation or empathy that might compromise security. Former ADX employees have admitted that this approach affects guards as much as prisoners. One officer told the Marshall Project, "After years in there, you forget what normal conversation sounds like. The quiet gets inside your head." Technology as the new warden. When ADX opened, it was considered the most technologically advanced prison on Earth. Over the years, the Bureau of Prisons has continuously upgraded it, introducing digital tracking, biometric scanners, and AI-assisted monitoring systems. Cameras feed directly to both the control center and regional command offices, creating what one warden called a panopticon of pixels. Even now, the facility's automation reduces human error to almost zero. Doors, lights, and alarms operate through encrypted computer systems. Inmates cannot touch light switches or windows. Air temperature, water flow, and cell lighting are all remotely managed. Medical and mental health visits occur through sealed glass booths equipped with microphones. The inmate never leaves the restraints during evaluation. Doctors have described the experience as treating a voice in a box. Every piece of mail, every legal document, and every phone call is scanned, logged, and archived. For those under special administrative measures, even attorney-client correspondence can be monitored for security breaches. Technology, in the eyes of ADX officials, is not a tool. It is a language of control. The machines never tire, never argue, never hesitate. They enforce rules with precision that no human being can match. A city of silence. Walking through ADX is like stepping into a vacuum. The silence is physical, it presses against the skin. There are no shouts, no laughter, no echoes of footsteps in crowded halls. Just the rhythmic hum of ventilation and the faint, metallic click of distant doors. Guards communicate through radios. Inmates communicate with no one. Visitors, rare and heavily restricted, describe an atmosphere of eerie stillness, as if sound itself has been swallowed by the building. This silence is intentional. The Bureau of Prisons discovered long ago that noise breeds emotion, and emotion breeds resistance. Silence pacifies. Silence isolates. Silence reshapes. For the inmates, silence becomes both punishment and mirror. It amplifies every thought, every regret, every fragment of guilt. Some begin talking to themselves. Others pray aloud to fill the void. A few retreat entirely into inner worlds, inventing voices or hallucinations to replace the absent human presence. Psychologists call this sensory deprivation syndrome. Within months, some inmates experience anxiety, paranoia, or dissociation. After a year, memory loss and hallucinations are common. After several years, many describe losing the ability to imagine life outside. ADX was built to break communication. In doing so, it breaks the mind. Inside ADX Florence, America's most secure supermax prison, full documentary, control without violence. Ironically, ADX is among the safest prisons in America for the staff. Since its opening, it has recorded almost no murders and only a handful of assaults. The architecture itself prevents chaos. But that calm comes at a cost. The absence of violence doesn't mean peace, it means suppression. A former warden once explained, "It's easy to run a perfect prison when no one can move, speak, or see each other." In other facilities, discipline depends on human judgment. At ADX, it depends on procedure. Every deviation triggers an automated response. Doors lock, alarms sound, units freeze. The system replaces discretion with programming. Even emergencies are handled with mechanical precision. Inmates on suicide watch are monitored by thermal cameras that detect movement and temperature changes. If an anomaly appears, too little motion, too much stillness, alerts flash in the control room. Officers respond within seconds. Yet despite the technology, suicides still happen. The human will, even crushed, finds ways to collapse inward. Blueprint for the future. The design of ADX became the model for dozens of supermax facilities across the United States. States like California, Virginia, Illinois, and Arizona adopted variations of the Florence blueprint: mass isolation, remote-controlled cells, and surveillance-driven order. Pelican Bay State Prison's Security Housing Unit, SHU, Red Onion State Prison in Virginia, and Tams Correctional Center in Illinois all owe their existence to the experiment that began in Colorado. Even other countries, like Australia and Brazil, studied the ADX model when designing their own maximum security units. But what started as a quest for safety has evolved into a debate about morality. Critics argue that ADX represents the dark perfection of modern punishment, a place where the absence of violence hides the presence of suffering. Supporters counter that it saves lives by preventing chaos. Both sides are right. The blueprint achieved what it was meant to: no escapes, no riots, no dead officers. But it also created something no blueprint had ever captured before: a prison that punishes not through pain, but through absence. A monument to fear. To walk the perimeter of ADX Florence is to see America's fear made physical. The concrete, the steel, the sensors, the silence, all of it speaks of a nation terrified of losing control. The prison's design ensures that its residents cannot harm another person, but it also ensures they cannot touch another human hand, see a horizon, or hear a living voice. The men who once ruled gangs, commanded armies, or built terror networks now exist in boxes designed to erase every trace of power. One architect who helped design the facility, speaking anonymously years later, summed it up simply: "We didn't build a prison. We built a tomb with lights." And indeed, ADX Florence became more than a structure. It became a symbol of what happens when safety becomes obsession. It was engineered to protect the world from its most dangerous men, but in doing so, it revealed something unsettling about the society that built it: a willingness to trade compassion for control and humanity for silence. The blueprint succeeded beyond imagination. It stopped riots. It ended escapes. It made the Bureau of Prisons invincible on paper. But it also created a place where men live without life, a space so sterile it cannot tell the difference between order and despair. And so, as the years passed, ADX Florence stood unchallenged, a flawless machine of confinement, humming in the Colorado desert, keeping its promise to America. The perfect prison. The perfect silence. The perfect illusion of peace. Life in a concrete tomb. There is no morning in ADX Florence, only light. It appears through the narrow slit of a window, not sunlight, but a sterile, filtered glow that changes little from dawn to dusk. The day begins not with noise, but with motion. The metallic click of steel, the hiss of hydraulics, the sound of a tray sliding through a slot. Somewhere in the building, an unseen officer taps a control button, and 1,000 mechanical movements ripple through the concrete like a pulse. Inside one of those cells, a man opens his eyes. The air is dry, heavy, sterile. His world measures 7 by 12 feet, the size of a bathroom, built entirely from concrete. The bed, desk, and stool are all part of the same structure, molded, immovable. The toilet and sink, made from stainless steel, are bolted to the wall. There is no mirror, no clock, no sense of distance. The only color comes from the muted gray of the walls and the white light that never truly fades. He stretches in silence, not because it's peaceful, but because there's nothing else to do. There are no voices, no footsteps outside his cell, no echo of human life. ADX Florence was designed for exactly this: a place where time has no shape and sound has no source. The Bureau of Prisons calls it controlled housing. In reality, it is a living tomb, engineered to hold men for years without the need for bars, violence, or visible guards. The control comes from architecture, from the slow suffocation of senses, from the quiet erosion of self. A day without a beginning at precisely 4 a.m., lights reach full brightness across the prison. The day starts long before the sun reaches the mountains. Inmates cannot turn lights on or off. Illumination is dictated by timers. There are no switches, no buttons, no control. Breakfast arrives between 5 o'clock and 5:30 a.m., passed through a slot in the door. The guard does not speak. He slides the tray through, waits for it to be taken, and locks the panel. The meal is simple: powdered eggs, oatmeal, and milk. The plastic utensils bend easily but cannot break. Everything about the tray is designed for safety, not comfort, not flavor, but control. When breakfast ends, the silence returns. For most inmates, the next 6 hours are spent alone in the same concrete box, with only two things allowed: reading material and a small black and white television that plays educational or religious programming on closed circuit. The channels are pre-selected. There are no news broadcasts, no live shows. Some inmates leave the TV off altogether, saying the sound of human voices they cannot see makes the loneliness worse. At 10 a.m., guards begin the recreation rotation. Each prisoner is escorted individually, handcuffed, shackled, and chained at the waist, through a series of remote-controlled doors to a small outdoor pen. The Bureau calls these recreation yards, but inmates call them dog runs. Each pen measures roughly 20 by 24 feet, enclosed by high concrete walls and a steel mesh roof. There is no view of the surrounding world, only the faint outline of the sky. Inmates can see the sun, but never the horizon. Some walk in slow circles. Others do push-ups or stand still, letting the cold Colorado wind touch their skin for the first time that day. An hour later, they are led back to their cells. For the rest of the day, there are no interactions, No phone calls unless approved. No movement without escort. Lunch and dinner follow the same silent ritual. A tray, a slot, a lock. The door never opens fully except when officers perform security checks. Even the briefest communication must pass through metal and glass. By 10 p.m., the lights dim slightly, but darkness never arrives. The hum of ventilation fills the air. Some inmates sleep immediately. Others stare at the ceiling, tracing the hairline cracks in the concrete. The human mind, deprived of motion, begins to wander through memory instead of space. Silence as punishment. Life at ADX Florence is not defined by violence or shouting. It is defined by nothing. The silence itself becomes the punishment. Inmates who once ruled criminal empires, who commanded gangs or plotted bombings, now speak to no one for weeks at a time. Letters are censored, phone calls are limited, visits are rare and always behind thick glass. Family members describe hearing their loved ones' voices flatten, losing tone and emotion over years of isolation. A psychologist who worked at ADX once said, "It's like talking to people who have forgotten they're alive." The isolation is not an accident, it is the philosophy. Every element of the prison's operation reinforces the idea that human contact equals danger. The Bureau believes that for certain men, isolation is the only form of safety, for guards, for society, and for the inmates themselves. But critics say the policy has gone too far, turning security into psychological torture. A 2013 Amnesty International report described ADX as a place where men are buried in silence. It documented inmates suffering hallucinations, panic attacks, and self-harm. One prisoner reportedly banged his head against the wall until he collapsed. Another, unable to bear the isolation, swallowed shards of glass. The Bureau denied systemic abuse, insisting that mental health staff visited regularly. But former employees admitted that the sheer size of the facility and the severity of restrictions made genuine treatment almost impossible. "You can't treat loneliness with paperwork," one staff member told the New York Times. Voices that no one hears among the inmates, patterns of mental deterioration are common. Men begin talking to themselves, whispering conversations they can't finish. Some keep imaginary companions. Others hear voices. The Bureau calls these behavioral reactions to isolation. Psychologists call them early signs of sensory deprivation psychosis. One prisoner, Jack Powers, became a symbol of what happens inside ADX. After years in solitary confinement, Powers mutilated himself repeatedly, writing letters to courts that described his cell as a coffin with air holes. In 2012, his testimony became part of a class action lawsuit against the Bureau of Prisons, Baycote v. Federal Bureau of Prisons, alleging that ADX's conditions violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Court documents revealed a horrifying truth. Many inmates at ADX were mentally ill before arrival, and isolation only deepened their conditions. Suicides became frequent. In one case, an inmate named Jose Vega was found hanging from his bed frame, leaving behind a single note: "I forgot what voices sound like." Even those who survive psychologically often change in ways that can never be undone. Former ADX prisoners describe struggling to re-enter normal prisons, unable to tolerate crowds or conversation. One said he preferred solitary confinement over returning to a communal cell. "Out there, I felt exposed," he told reporters after transfer. "In Florence, I knew who I was, nobody." The guards silence. The officers of ADX are as bound by rules as the inmates. They work in pairs, move in silence, and communicate mostly through radios. Every interaction is scripted: open the slot, give the command, close the door. No small talk, no emotion. Some officers spend years without hearing an inmate speak a full sentence. Former Warden Robert Hood once admitted that working at ADX changes you. Guards often develop insomnia, paranoia, or depression. The constant silence, the tension, the need for vigilance, it wears them down. "It's like guarding ghosts," Hood said. "You start feeling the emptiness looking back at you. Every movement is recorded. Every incident is logged. Even when nothing happens, which is most of the time, the paperwork continues. Officers walk the same paths day after day, past identical gray doors, identical cameras, identical lights. They, too, become part of the machine. Some try to humanize their work. A few quietly wish inmates a good morning during meal rounds, though it's discouraged. Others say they sometimes pause outside cells to listen, not because they expect danger, but because they need to hear another living sound. The forgotten mind for psychologists, ADX is both a challenge and a warning. Decades of research show that long-term isolation can alter brain function. Neurons degenerate from lack of stimulation. Emotional regulation deteriorates. The ability to empathize, reason, and maintain identity begins to fade. A 2014 study cited in the Lancet Psychiatry found that inmates kept in solitary confinement for more than 1 year exhibited symptoms similar to those of severe trauma survivors: hypervigilance, disassociation, and emotional flatness. Some developed panic attacks at the sound of footsteps, associating it with the arrival of guards. At ADX, those symptoms are not exceptions, they are the norm. For many, the only moments of physical contact come during strip searches or handcuffing. Even medical care occurs behind glass. The message is constant: you are dangerous, you are watched, and you are alone. This atmosphere shapes not only behavior, but identity. Inmates begin to define themselves through the prison's expectations. They stop being who they were, said one prison chaplain. They become what the walls think they are. Faith in the void religion is one of the few forms of relief allowed at ADX. Chaplains visit inmates individually, separated by thick glass, their voices echoing through intercoms. Many prisoners cling to faith not as salvation but as structure, a way to measure time and resist the emptiness. One guard recalled walking past cells during Ramadan and hearing faint whispers of prayer through the ventilation shafts. They couldn't see each other, he said, but they were praying together, one whisper at a time. For some, faith becomes defiance. For others, surrender. In either case, it's one of the few forms of freedom left, thought that the system cannot monitor or suppress. Moments of memory. The rarest part of life at ADX is memory. The past becomes a distant thing. With no clocks, no calendars, and no human conversation, inmates lose track of years. Some still write letters, dated only by guesswork. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, spent decades at ADX before his death in 2023. Those who corresponded with him described his letters as cold, meticulous, detached. He rarely mentioned the prison itself, focusing instead on mathematics and philosophy. It's like he replaced reality with logic, one correspondent said. He refused to let the building touch him. Others are not as lucky. Ramzi Youssef, the 1993 World Trade Center bomber, reportedly spends nearly all day reading engineering textbooks. He has no cellmate, no contact with other prisoners, no real human voice. Officials say he once told staff, "I'm not living, I'm waiting." Each story inside ADX ends the same way, with a man reduced to thought, stripped of power, surrounded by silence. A system that feeds itself life inside ADX is meant to be temporary. The Bureau's step-down program allows compliant inmates to earn gradual privileges, more recreation, limited social contact, eventual transfer to lower security prisons. But progress is slow, and failure resets the clock. For some, the program is unreachable. Mental illness, paranoia, or hopelessness prevent them from meeting behavioral standards. They remain locked in perpetual isolation, too unstable to comply, too dangerous to release. The cycle becomes self-sustaining. The more isolation damages them, the more it justifies keeping them there. A federal judge reviewing ADX conditions once wrote, "The system that created these men has no plan for their return to humanity." When silence becomes the sentence in most prisons, punishment ends when a sentence expires. In ADX Florence, punishment is the sentence. The isolation is not a temporary measure. It is the essence of confinement. The state does not merely restrict movement, it restricts existence. For the outside world, this system works. There are no riots, no mass escapes, no high-profile murders. The Bureau points to those statistics as proof of success. But for the men inside, it is a form of slow erasure. One psychologist who interviewed former inmates said, "They don't speak about their crimes. They speak about silence, about walls, about time. It's as if the crime stopped mattering. The cell became their only story. And so, day after day, year after year, ADX continues its quiet operation. Meals, locks, lights, reports. Lives reduced to patterns of repetition, guarded by men who no longer raise their voices. The system runs with machine precision, its purpose fulfilled, total control, total order, total silence. But inside those walls, something else grows, a truth no concrete can bury. That silence, the very thing meant to keep the world safe, is also the sound of countless minds dissolving. For the Bureau of Prisons, ADX is success. For history, it is a warning. In Florence, there are no screams, no chaos, no rebellion. Only breathing. Only walls. Only the quiet hum of a nation's most secure idea of justice, and the men it slowly teaches to disappear within it. The men inside. The story of ADX Florence is not complete without the men who live and die within its walls. Each cell houses a life that once captured headlines, a name tied to blood, ideology, or betrayal. To the outside world, they are monsters. Inside the supermax, they are shadows, sealed in concrete. No one sees them. No one hears them. But their stories are the reason ADX exists. The Bureau of Prisons calls it a collection of America's most dangerous minds. Journalists call it a living museum of crime. To those who work there, it's simply the program, a system that has erased hundreds of men from the public eye, each one serving a life sentence inside a tomb that hums with electricity and silence. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber's silence. When Theodore John Kaczynski arrived at ADX Florence in 1998, the staff already knew he would be different. A former mathematics prodigy turned domestic terrorist, Kaczynski had waged a 17-year bombing campaign against universities, airlines, and technology companies, killing 3 and injuring 23. His crimes were methodical, intellectual, and deeply personal, a war against modernity itself. He was brought to Florence under heavy escort, chained at wrists and ankles, eyes scanning the horizon as if memorizing the desert he would never walk again. Once inside, the prison structure suited him perfectly. He had lived in isolation before, in a cabin in the Montana wilderness. The transition from forest solitude to concrete solitude was less jarring than for most. He requested no television. He refused most interactions. For years, he wrote letters to journalists and academics who sought to understand his anti-industrial philosophy. Each envelope came from the same place. Ted Kaczynski, hashtag 04475-046, ADX Florence. Staff described him as calm, articulate, and eerily disciplined. He spent hours reading mathematics and philosophy texts, occasionally corresponding with scholars who saw him as an intellectual curiosity rather than a killer. But as the years passed, his tone grew colder. His handwriting became smaller, tighter, the pen of a man whose world was shrinking with every page. In 2023, at age 81, Kaczynski died in his cell, reportedly by suicide. The walls that had silenced his voice for 25 years also became his final witness. For ADX Florence, his death symbolized the system's paradox. It preserved security flawlessly, yet consumed the human spirit completely. Ramzi Youssef, the engineer of fear. A few doors away from Kaczynski lived another architect of destruction, Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Captured in Pakistan and extradited to the United States, Youssef represented a new breed of criminal, international, ideological, and unrepentant. His bomb, a 1,200-pound urea nitrate device placed in the underground garage of the Twin Towers, killed 6 people and injured more than 1,000. When he entered ADX, Youssef was assigned to H Unit, the most restrictive part of the prison, nicknamed Bombers Row. Here, terrorism suspects and convicted extremists live under Special Administrative Measures, SAMs, communication restrictions designed to prevent them from spreading messages or coordinating with followers outside. Under SAMs, Youssef cannot write freely, cannot speak without supervision, cannot even know who occupies the cells near him. His letters are read and censored before leaving the prison. His visits are conducted through glass, monitored by intelligence officials. According to court filings, he spends his days reading engineering textbooks and religious texts. He has no television privileges, no contact with other inmates. In 2011, a rare psychological evaluation described him as lucid, coherent, and emotionally neutral, a mind functioning without a world. Even after decades of isolation, Youssef has never expressed remorse. When asked by a federal agent years earlier if he regretted the bombing, he replied, "If I had the chance, I'd do it again." That sentence became his epitaph long before death. Zacharias Moussaoui, the 20th hijacker. In the cell beside Youssef lives Zacharias Moussaoui, the only man ever convicted in U.S. courts for his role in the September 11th attacks. A French national of Moroccan descent, Moussaoui was arrested before the attacks, but later admitted he was part of the al-Qaeda conspiracy. During his trial, he infamously mocked victims' families and declared allegiance to Osama bin Laden. Now, inside ADX, there is no stage for defiance. His life follows the same mechanical rhythm as every other inmate's. 1 hour of solitude in the recreation pen, 23 hours in the cell. He has no contact with other prisoners and communicates only through written requests to staff. In 2015, he filed a series of handwritten motions to federal court, claiming mistreatment and psychological warfare. The filings, full of erratic capital letters and broken logic, revealed a man unraveling under the weight of his own silence. In one motion, he described ADX as a prison built to destroy the brain slowly, without blood, without sound. Even his attorneys admitted they no longer recognized him. Whatever ideology once drove him had dissolved into confusion and bitterness. The system had done what no interrogation could. It muted him completely. Richard Reed, the man who failed. Another resident of Bombers Row is Richard Reed, the British-born extremist better known as the Shoe Bomber. In December 2001, Reed boarded American Airlines Flight 63 from Paris to Miami with explosives hidden in his shoes. He tried to ignite them mid-flight, but was overpowered by passengers and crew. His failure saved hundreds of lives, but his intent earned him a lifetime in Florence. Like Youssef and Moussaoui, Reed lives under SAMs. He spends most of his days reading religious texts, praying, and writing legal motions that rarely reach the outside world. His cell is monitored constantly. Even his prayer rug is inspected. In court, he once declared himself a soldier of Allah. At ADX, he has no soldiers to command. He eats, prays, and sleeps in silence. For men like Reed, the punishment is not death, it is irrelevance. Robert Hansen, the spy who vanished. Not all prisoners at ADX are bombers or extremists. Some are traitors. Robert Philip Hansen, once a senior FBI agent, spent over 20 years selling U.S. secrets to the Soviet Union and later Russia. His betrayal compromised countless operations and led to the deaths of American assets overseas. When Hansen was caught in 2001, he was called the worst spy in U.S. history. His sentence, life without parole. His destination, ADX Florence. Inside, Hansen's existence mirrors the coldness of his crimes. Former wardens describe him as detached, emotionless, a man who betrayed not out of ideology but boredom. He reads religious books, writes long reflections about faith and morality, and rarely speaks. One chaplain who met him described the encounter as speaking to a ghost who still believed he had a soul. For the Bureau of Prisons, Hansen represented a new kind of threat, one that couldn't be neutralized by isolation alone. His intelligence background meant he could manipulate through language, code, or influence. The solution was the same as always: silence. Hansen died in 2023, collapsing in his cell after more than 2 decades in solitary. He died as he lived, unseen, unheard, unremarked. Thomas Silverstein, the man buried alive. If any inmate embodies the philosophy behind ADX, it is Thomas Silverstein. A leader of the Aryan Brotherhood, Silverstein was responsible for multiple murders inside the federal prison system, including the killing of Officer Merle Klutz at USP Marion in 1983 an event that triggered the nationwide lockdown that led to ADX's creation. For that act, Silverstein became a ghost long before ADX was built. He was kept in solitary confinement for 35 years, one of the longest in U.S. history. When Florence opened, he was transferred there immediately, confined to what staff unofficially called the Silverstein Suite, a custom cell built for total isolation. He ate alone, exercised alone, and spoke to no one but guards through metal doors. In letters later released to journalists, he described his existence as being buried alive in a concrete box. Silverstein died in 2019 at age 67, having spent more than half his life without human touch. His death closed a circle. The man whose crime inspired ADX became one of its longest residents. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the king in a cage. When Mexican drug lord Joaquin Guzman Lora, known as El Chapo, was sentenced to life imprisonment in 2019, his destination was obvious. After two daring escapes from Mexican prisons, one through a mile-long tunnel dug beneath his cell, no other facility in the world could guarantee his containment. His transfer to ADX drew global media attention. For the first time in decades, the world's most powerful cartel boss was powerless. No phones, no bribes, no tunnels. Inside Florence, Guzman lives under special administrative measures similar to those for terrorists. His contact with family is limited to a few monitored visits a year. Reports from his lawyers describe him as suffering from severe isolation. He spends 23 hours a day alone, with only a slit of sunlight and a small television. His meals are delivered through a slot, his conversations recorded, his mail censored. In Mexico, he commanded thousands. In Colorado, he commands nothing. His empire dissolved into the same silence that swallows every name at ADX. The forgotten hundreds. Not all ADX inmates are famous. Many are gang leaders, murderers, or career criminals who killed guards or fellow inmates in lower security prisons. Others are domestic extremists or organized crime figures whose influence extended beyond the walls. They share one common trait: they were considered too dangerous to exist among others. The system calls them non-manageable. Their stories rarely reach the outside. No journalists write about them. Their families visit once every few years, if at all. For most, ADX is a one-way journey, a place where identity fades with each year of silence. One former guard said, "There's a whole world inside those walls that the world will never know about." Men live and die there without anyone remembering their names. The myth of control. For the Bureau of Prisons, these men justify the existence of ADX. Every act of terror, every betrayal, every murder that led them there becomes part of the prison's mythology. Officials point to the lack of escapes and riots as proof that the system works. But psychologists, human rights advocates, and even former wardens question whether the price of that control is too high. Many of these inmates are no longer a threat, their influence neutralized, their bodies weakened by years of confinement. Yet they remain locked in isolation designed for monsters, not men. Robert Hood, who served as warden from 2002 to 2005, later told the Denver Post, "We built a clean version of hell. The doors close, and you never come back." It's not just punishment. It's erasure. Inside ADX, the world's most infamous criminals are not rehabilitated, not redeemed, merely silenced. Their crimes remain in history, but their voices do not. Each man once defined a different kind of power: intellectual, political, criminal, ideological. But Florence strips them all to the same essence: a number, a cell, a routine, a hum. They breathe, they think, they exist, but only barely. ADX Florence was built to contain evil. Instead, it built a monument to control, where men who once ruled nations, gangs, and networks now rule nothing but their own fading memories. And in the perfect silence of that fortress, justice and mercy have become indistinguishable, because here, even the strongest minds eventually forget which one was supposed to come first. Inside Bombers Row. Hidden deep within the heart of ADX Florence lies a corridor that few outside the Bureau of Prisons have ever seen: H Unit. To the general public, it's a line in an architectural blueprint. To those who work within the fortress, it's a name whispered with caution, Bombers Row. This is where the most tightly controlled prisoners in the entire United States are kept, men whose words are considered as dangerous as their crimes. Here, communication is a weapon, and silence is the only safeguard. The walls of H Unit are thicker, the light colder, and the cameras more numerous than anywhere else in the prison. Even by ADX standards, where human contact is already nearly non-existent, this wing is another world, a sealed dimension of pure surveillance. The creation of H Unit. The origins of H Unit can be traced to the mid-1990s, after a series of terrorism cases revealed a flaw in the federal prison system. Officials discovered that convicted terrorists and extremists, even while incarcerated, were still inspiring followers outside through letters, coded messages, and even phone calls. The most notable case came from World Trade Center bomber Ramzi Youssef, who, after his conviction, was found attempting to pass messages to other radical inmates through shared legal materials. Another involved Omar Abdul Rahman, the blind sheik, whose phone calls from a federal medical prison were used to send instructions to followers overseas. The response from Washington was swift and absolute. In 1996, the Department of Justice authorized the use of Special Administrative Measures, or SAMs, restrictions designed to isolate specific inmates deemed national security threats. The Bureau of Prisons soon realized that standard facilities couldn't handle the new requirements. They needed an environment where even a whisper could be contained. When ADX Florence opened, one of its most secret wings was reserved for this purpose. H Unit was born, a place where communication itself would be treated as contraband. The anatomy of isolation. The H Unit is unlike any other part of ADX. Each of its cells is separated by thick layers of concrete and steel, lined with sensors that detect vibration, temperature, and sound. Every cell contains a microphone embedded in the ceiling and cameras that record continuously, even when the inmate sleeps. All lighting and ventilation are remotely controlled. No inmate can see another, hear another, or send even a scrap of paper without multiple layers of inspection. The doors here are not simple steel slabs. They are triple-sealed containment barriers, with secondary locking mechanisms activated remotely from the control center. The walls are soundproofed to military-grade standards. Even if a man screams, no one beyond his door will hear him. Unlike other units, H Unit has no windows that open to the outside. Prisoners never glimpse sunlight directly. Their cells are lit by fluorescent fixtures that mimic day and night cycles. The isolation is total. For inmates under SAMs, contact with the world is measured in minutes per month. Phone calls, limited to one per quarter, monitored by FBI agents. Mail, read, redacted, and delayed by weeks for translation and security checks. Legal communication, allowed only with pre-cleared attorneys under strict supervision. Visits, non-contact, conducted through soundproof glass with FBI monitors in attendance. Every word, every gesture, every syllable is recorded. The residents of Bombers Row. To understand the spirit of H Unit, one must understand its residents. Ramzi Youssef remains one of the unit's longest-standing inmates. Captured in Pakistan in 1995 and extradited to the U.S., Youssef once saw himself as a revolutionary engineer, a man who believed he could reshape history through terror. Inside H Unit, that conviction has decayed into routine. He reads engineering manuals and Islamic texts. For over 2 decades, he has spoken to no other inmate. When his lawyers visited him early in his sentence, he reportedly told them, "I am living in the future. They have already built the prison for the mind." In the cell nearby sits Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. Once loud and defiant, he now prays quietly 5 times a day, his routines precise and unbroken. The prison chaplain described him as a man existing in perfect stillness. His letters, when approved, contain verses from the Quran and reflections on discipline. Most are never delivered. A few doors down is Zacharias Moussaoui, the self-proclaimed 20th hijacker. His confinement is among the harshest in America. After years of erratic filings and violent outbursts in court, his behavior at ADX reportedly oscillates between moments of calm and manic energy. His writings, occasionally made public through legal filings, are rambling, paranoid, and haunted. They have erased my world, he once wrote, and replaced it with air that listens. Other men have passed through H Unit over the years. Terry Nichols, the Oklahoma City bomber's accomplice, held temporarily before transfer. Ahmed Gailani, the only Guantanamo detainee tried in U.S. Civilian Court. Jakar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber, before his move to death row in Terre Haute. Each name marks a moment in modern American history. Together, they form the living archive of the country's greatest fears. Life under special administrative measures, SAMs are designed to prevent terrorism from reproducing itself through words. Under this policy, the Bureau of Prisons monitors every outgoing and incoming piece of communication. Inmates cannot speak Arabic or other non-English languages on monitored calls without translation. Letters are translated, redacted, and often withheld entirely. The rules extend to thought. A prisoner's reading materials are limited to pre-approved religious or educational texts. Even the Quran, a common comfort among Muslim inmates, is sometimes restricted to certain interpretations deemed non-radical. For inmates, this constant filtration of speech becomes a psychological weapon. They begin censoring themselves internally, unsure which thoughts are safe to write. In an affidavit from one of Moussawi's attorneys, she described him as speaking in circles, as if afraid his own mind could betray him. Even lawyers find themselves trapped by the restrictions. Every legal visit requires security clearance from the Department of Justice. Every document exchanged is inspected by intelligence officers. Conversations that would be confidential in any other setting are monitored, recorded, and sometimes interrupted. Critics argue that these measures violate due process and human rights. But the government's justification is unwavering. One letter, one coded word, one message could lead to the death of innocents. The sound of stillness. The silence of H Unit is unlike the silence of the rest of ADX. It is heavier, denser, engineered. Guards describe walking its corridor as moving through vacuum. Even their own footsteps sound muted. The hum of the air system is constant, a low mechanical drone that becomes the unit's heartbeat. Each inmate's life is an identical rhythm. Meals through the slot, lights that rise and dim at scheduled intervals, a brief hour in an enclosed recreation room, an indoor pen with no contact or view. There is no exercise yard, no fresh air, no horizon. Just artificial light, filtered air, and the same cycle repeated endlessly. One officer who worked there for years told The Guardian, "It's the quiet that gets to you. The building is too still. It feels like even time is locked up." Psychological fallout. H Unit's conditions have drawn international condemnation. Human rights groups, including Amnesty International and the United Nations, have described them as a form of psychological torture. The effects on inmates are profound. Psychiatrists who have evaluated former SAMS prisoners report severe anxiety, paranoia, depression, and cognitive decline. The human mind, deprived of sensory input and communication, begins to fracture. In a 2013 federal filing, defense attorneys for one H Unit prisoner stated, "Our client has not seen another human face in over a decade." Even prison staff acknowledged the toll. One officer admitted anonymously that some of those men don't even look human anymore, just pale, blinking shapes that forget how to make eye contact. In 2015, the Baycoat v. BOP lawsuit included affidavits referencing SAM's prisoners, describing them as permanently altered by isolation. Though the settlement mandated increased mental health monitoring, the core structure of H Unit remained untouched. The Bureau insists that the unit is essential for national security. The courts, though often sympathetic to human rights concerns, have largely agreed. The logic is chilling but effective. Safety outweighs suffering. The guard's perspective. The officers who work in H Unit are among the most highly trained in the Bureau of Prisons. Their job is paradoxical: to protect the public from men who can harm with words, yet to interact with them only through mechanical processes. Each shift is precise and procedural. No officer works alone. All movements are recorded and monitored. Every interaction follows protocol down to the second. Guards never use inmate names, only numbers. They don't make eye contact longer than necessary. Several officers have admitted that the psychological toll of working there can mirror that of the inmates. Some describe vivid nightmares, others sudden anxiety when hearing silence in their own homes. One retired staffer said, "You start living like the building wants you to, quiet, controlled, detached. You stop being yourself." Despite the strain, many defend their work. They've seen what happens when communication isn't controlled: riots, conspiracies, murders. For them, H Unit is not cruelty, it's containment, faith, and resistance. Religion remains the last refuge for most of H Unit's inhabitants. For some, faith becomes rebellion, a structure that the Bureau cannot completely regulate. Inmates like Richard Reed use prayer as rhythm, a way to mark the passing of days that otherwise blur into sameness. Chaplains, permitted limited access under tight restrictions, describe surreal moments of connection. "You're talking to a voice through glass," one said. "You don't see emotion, you hear it." That's the only human thing left in there. But not every inmate finds solace. Some reject faith entirely, turning inward until even belief feels like noise. These men often deteriorate fastest. Without ritual, without hope, the silence becomes unbearable. A wing that never sleeps. Unlike other parts of ADX, H Unit never truly shuts down. Its lights remain operational around the clock. Its cameras feed continuously to federal monitoring stations not just in Florence, but in Washington, D.C., and Quantico, Virginia. The FBI and Bureau of Prisons coordinate closely to track every action within the unit. If a prisoner speaks in his sleep, it's recorded. If he writes a letter, it's scanned. If he moves unexpectedly, an alarm triggers. In 2010, a maintenance technician reportedly described the control room's monitoring system as watching ghosts on a screen. Dozens of monitors display tiny, grainy images, each one a man alone in his cell, pacing or sitting or staring at the wall. There are no incidents to respond to, no emergencies to solve. The system is so tight that the absence of activity becomes the goal. The less that happens, the more successful the operation. And so, the staff's role is not to manage behavior, but to preserve stillness. The ethics of eternal silence. Over the years, journalists, legal scholars, and human rights experts have debated whether H Unit's existence crosses a moral boundary. Is it justified to silence a man so completely that he ceases to think of himself as human? Can a democratic society build a system where thought itself is the enemy? The United Nations has condemned such conditions under its Mandela rules, declaring prolonged solitary confinement beyond 15 days as cruel, inhuman, and degrading. H Unit inmates endure it for decades. Yet every attempt to dismantle or reform the program runs into the same argument. These men orchestrated mass murder. They killed innocents, destroyed lives, and inspired future killers. If they speak again, who listens? And what happens next? The question remains unresolved. The silence continues. The hallway of no return. Officers who walk H Unit speak of a particular feeling, as if the air itself resists sound. The hallway is narrow, the lighting sterile, the floor polished to mirror-like precision. Every step echoes faintly, then vanishes. At the far end, a sign reads simply, "Restricted area, authorized personnel only." Beyond that point, the world disappears. Every door along that corridor represents a story the public will never fully hear. The engineer who built a bomb, the spy who betrayed a nation, the extremist who believed in apocalypse. They live here not as citizens, not even as prisoners, but as symbols of the government's ultimate control. No one escapes H Unit. No one rehabilitates. They simply endure, year after year, until their bodies fail or their minds fade into the endless hum of ventilation. And when that happens, they are quietly replaced. Another name, another cell, another life sealed behind soundproof concrete. The unit remains untouched, unchallenged, unchanging. America's invisible chamber, where words are forbidden and silence becomes the loudest sentence ever written. The step-down experiment. By the early 2000s, ADX Florence had earned an infamous reputation. To the public, it was the fortress that never failed. No escapes, no riots, no murders. But inside the Bureau of Prisons, another truth had begun to emerge. The system was perfect on paper, yet unsustainable in reality. Psychiatrists, chaplains, and even some wardens began warning that men were deteriorating beyond recovery. Inmates who had spent years in total isolation were hallucinating, mutilating themselves, or spiraling into irreversible mental illness. Guards were developing anxiety and depression. The silence that had once symbolized order was starting to consume everyone trapped within it. The Bureau needed to adapt. But how do you change a machine designed to never change? In 2008, under growing pressure from lawsuits and human rights investigations, the Bureau introduced what it called the step-down program, an experiment in controlled reintegration meant to prove that even the most dangerous prisoners could be guided back toward normal social behavior. It wasn't a reform born of compassion. It was survival. The origins of reform. The first spark of change came not from within ADX, but from a courtroom. In 2006, civil rights attorneys began filing suits on behalf of inmates who claimed that prolonged solitary confinement at ADX violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Their arguments relied on decades of psychiatric research showing that isolation caused severe and often permanent psychological harm. The Bureau of Prisons initially dismissed these claims, calling them exaggerations by manipulative inmates. But the evidence grew impossible to ignore. Reports from Amnesty International, the Marshall Project, and the New York Times detailed inmates cutting themselves, smearing feces on walls, and attempting suicide. In 2012, the landmark case Baycoat v. Federal Bureau of Prisons exposed internal records showing that dozens of men with documented mental illnesses were being held in ADX under conditions that made treatment impossible. The lawsuit described cells smeared with blood, men talking to invisible companions, and guards walking past without intervention because the system prioritized control over care. The court's response was damning. Even the most secure institutions must not abandon the duty to preserve human dignity. The Bureau had two choices: reform or risk losing control of its most powerful institution. Thus, the step-down program was born, a calculated evolution of the supermax philosophy. A new kind of experiment. The step-down program was never meant to soften ADX. It was designed to manage it more efficiently, a structured path that allowed the Bureau to gradually reduce restrictions for inmates who demonstrated compliance and stability. The system had 4 phases, each with specific privileges and behavioral benchmarks. Phase 1, Control Unit, the most restrictive level. Inmates remained in near total isolation, 23 hours a day in their cells. Contact with staff was minimal and privileges were non-existent. To advance, an inmate had to show consistent obedience and psychological stability over several months. Phase 2, Intermediate. Inmates were allowed limited programming, reading assignments, written reflections, or monitored therapy sessions. Television and limited commissary privileges were introduced. A few began supervised phone calls. Phase 3, Pre-transfer. Group therapy and communal recreation began under heavy surveillance. For the first time in years, some inmates could see and speak to others, a moment both liberating and terrifying. The slightest misconduct could result in being sent back to Phase 1. Phase 4, Transition. The final stage allowed transfer to lower security federal prisons or communication managed units, CMUs. Successful inmates regained limited social contact, education programs, and family visits. The design was bureaucratic precision, a reward-based ladder meant to control behavior through hope. But for many, it was an illusion. The reality of the step-down program. When the first wave of inmates entered the step-down program, officials expected enthusiasm. Instead, they found fear. After years of silence, some men refused to leave their cells for group sessions. One psychologist recalled coaxing an inmate for weeks before he would step into a room with others. He didn't trust the air, she said. He thought someone would attack him. For others, human interaction triggered panic attacks. Inmates who had lived a decade without hearing another voice suddenly felt overwhelmed by sound. The experience of proximity, another breathing body in the same space, became unbearable. One participant later described his first group therapy session. I could hear their voices bouncing off the walls. I couldn't tell where they were coming from. It felt like the room was talking to me. Some inmates thrived under the structure, finding a fragile sense of purpose in progress charts and therapy assignments. They cleaned their cells, wrote letters, and began imagining futures beyond the supermax. For the first time in years, they felt seen. But for many, progress proved impossible. The damage was already done. Years of isolation had eroded social instincts and emotional stability. Compliance became mechanical, a mimicry of cooperation rather than genuine rehabilitation. A psychologist working with the program put it plainly: you can't rebuild what's already been erased. Hope is control. To the Bureau, the step-down program was a success story. It gave ADX a public image of reform, a talking point against critics who accused the prison of violating human rights. But to those inside, it often felt like another layer of control. The system turned hope into currency. Advancement depended on perfect obedience, yet the standards were vague and subjective. Inmates described being sent back to earlier phases for minor infractions: a missed count, a misplaced word in a therapy session, or an emotional outburst during evaluation. The message was clear: the only acceptable emotion inside ADX was compliance. Letters smuggled from participants described the process as a leash made of promises. One inmate wrote, "They say I'm free to earn my freedom, but the only thing I can control is how quietly I disappear." Guards saw the same dynamic. One officer told the Denver Post, "The step-down program looks good on paper, but it's still Florence. You can't fix solitary by giving it levels." The psychology of reintegration. The step-down program forced the Bureau to confront a question it had avoided since ADX opened. What happens when men who've lived in silence are asked to rejoin the world? The answer, as early participants revealed, was chaos. During supervised group sessions, some inmates sat rigid and speechless, unable to speak after years of isolation. Others exploded in anger or wept uncontrollably. The prison psychologists had to relearn how to measure progress, not in normal terms, but in microgestures. Eye contact lasting 3 seconds, a voice raised above a whisper, a handshake without recoil. Many who advanced to Phase 4 struggled with the transition to lower security prisons. Their habits, silence, distrust, hypervigilance, made them targets in general population units. Some requested to be sent back to isolation. "Out there, too many people," one wrote in a transfer evaluation. "Here, I know the rules." Experts began comparing long-term ADX confinement to post-traumatic stress disorder. The human brain, conditioned to constant control and surveillance, struggled to adapt to environments where freedom existed. Rehabilitation, it turned out, was not the same as release. The case studies. One of the most notable early participants was Jack Powers, whose self-mutilation and psychosis had been cited in the Baycoat v. BOP case. After years of therapy under the step-down program, he managed to stabilize enough to transfer to a lower security facility. His story became a rare example of success, but even he described the cost. In a 2018 interview after his release, Powers said, "They didn't teach me how to live again. They taught me how to pretend." He still struggled with anxiety, hallucinations, and paranoia. Another inmate, whose name remains sealed in court documents, refused to leave ADX even after qualifying for transfer. He told staff he feared crowds, open spaces, and even the sound of birds. "Too much noise," he said. "It hurts." These stories revealed what the Bureau had never admitted publicly: that isolation rewires the human mind. Some damage cannot be undone. The Bureau's defense. Despite criticism, Bureau officials maintained that the step-down program represented meaningful progress. In official reports to Congress, they cited reduced incidents of violence, improved staff safety, and increased compliance rates. ADX is not a place of punishment, one report stated. It is a place of management. But those who work there knew better. Warden Robert Hood, who once oversaw the facility, later told 60 Minutes, "You can't run a place like that without losing a piece of your soul. We controlled the environment so perfectly that we forgot what it meant to be human." The Bureau's internal logic remained unshaken. rehabilitation could only occur through control. The step-down program was not about freedom. It was about conditioning, turning dangerous men into predictable ones. The critics, civil rights attorneys, psychologists, and even former correctional officials condemned the step-down program as cosmetic reform. Dr. Craig Haney, one of America's foremost experts on prison psychology, called it a bureaucratic illusion. You cannot undo sensory deprivation by rearranging its schedule, he said in a 2016 hearing. If a man has spent 10 years talking to walls, giving him an hour of small talk with another inmate doesn't restore humanity. It just reminds him what he lost. International observers echoed this sentiment. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture declared in 2017 that prolonged solitary confinement, even with phased privileges, violated international law. ADX remained under scrutiny, but the United States defended it as a necessary instrument of national security. Inside the program, former staff described the step-down program as a paradox, a system meant to create change, run by people conditioned to prevent it. Therapists and correctional officers operated under conflicting philosophies. Therapy requires trust, security requires suspicion. One psychologist recalled a session where a prisoner, after months of silence, finally cried. She wanted to comfort him, but couldn't. Physical contact was forbidden. So I sat there, watching him break, and I did nothing, she said. That's the job. Even success was hard to measure. Some inmates advanced through all 4 phases only to relapse under the weight of freedom. Others refused to participate entirely, choosing to remain in the stability of isolation rather than face the uncertainty of interaction. As one inmate wrote in a letter to his sister, "In here, the walls are my friends. Out there, everyone's a stranger." The step-down paradox. A decade after its launch, the step-down program became the symbol of ADX's evolution, proof that the Bureau could adapt, at least on paper. But it also exposed a deeper truth. You cannot rehabilitate a man without acknowledging the harm done to him. The program's statistics showed improvement, fewer incidents, more transfers, fewer suicides. Yet behind those numbers lay a quieter tragedy, men who had learned obedience, not recovery. The system measured success by silence. If inmates followed rules, attended therapy, and avoided conflict, they were considered stable. Whether they could ever live outside again was irrelevant. The step-down program had succeeded in teaching prisoners how to survive ADX, but not how to survive freedom. The human cost. By the 2020s, the Bureau had quietly expanded step-down initiatives across other federal facilities, using ADX as the blueprint. But even within its walls, staff knew the experiment had limits. The human brain, once bent by years of isolation, does not straighten. One veteran guard put it bluntly, "You can't unteach silence." The men who passed through the step-down program emerged changed, cautious, quiet, and detached. They follow orders, speak softly, avoid eye contact. On the surface, they look rehabilitated. In reality, they are simply conditioned. This is the paradox at the heart of ADX Florence, control masquerading as reform. A machine that creates calm by erasing chaos, and everything that makes people human along with it. For the Bureau of Prisons, it's proof of effectiveness. For the men inside, it's the cruelest trick of all, a path to freedom that leads only deeper into the walls. The lawsuits that changed everything. For nearly 2 decades, ADX Florence stood untouched, a concrete embodiment of absolute control. Its silence was its defense, its order its justification. From Washington to the Rocky Mountains, federal officials praised the facility as the ultimate success story in modern corrections. No escapes, no riots, no dead officers. But outside those walls, a different story was forming, one built on letters written in shaky handwriting, on blood-stained cell walls, and on the testimonies of men the system had erased. Their words traveled slowly through legal channels, but once they surfaced, they would shake the foundations of the Bureau of Prisons. The lawsuits began not with headlines, but with voices no one was supposed to hear. The seeds of revolt. The first serious cracks appeared in the early 2000s, when advocacy groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, began receiving reports from inside ADX. Inmates described life in permanent lockdown, reporting hallucinations, suicides, and untreated mental illness. One letter, smuggled out by a prisoner named Jack Powers, described the facility as a clean version of hell. He wrote, "I see things that aren't real. Faces in the concrete. Voices in the vent. I tell them I need help, and they tell me to fill out a form." For years, these accounts went ignored. ADX's secrecy made verification difficult. The Bureau dismissed the complaints as fabrications from dangerous manipulators. But by 2011, the evidence became impossible to deny. Dozens of former inmates and their families began filing federal claims. Their stories aligned too closely to be coincidence. The same symptoms appeared again and again: anxiety, paranoia, self-harm, and suicide. The same descriptions repeated: lights that never turn off, walls that whisper, guards who walk past without seeing. What had been dismissed as exaggeration was now being documented as medical fact. Baycoat v. Federal Bureau of Prisons. In June 2012, a group of attorneys from the Arnold and Porter law firm filed what would become the most consequential case in the history of ADX Florence. Baycoat v. Federal Bureau of Prisons. The lead plaintiff, Troy Anderson, had spent years inside ADX suffering from severe mental illness. His complaint accused the Bureau of knowingly placing mentally ill prisoners in conditions that violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. The lawsuit's other plaintiffs, including Jack Powers and multiple unnamed inmates, provided testimony describing a world of silence, neglect, and despair. They recounted suicide attempts ignored by staff, psychotic breaks treated with discipline instead of care, and medical requests lost in bureaucratic limbo. Court filings described cells smeared with blood, men screaming through the night, and guards who avoided eye contact as they passed. One document quoted an officer saying, "If you're crazy, ADX will make you sane or dead." The lawsuit alleged that the Bureau had created a mental illness factory, a system that punished vulnerability and rewarded silence. For the first time, the public glimpsed what the government had long kept hidden: the human cost of total control. The evidence of madness. During discovery, lawyers gained access to internal Bureau of Prisons documents that painted a devastating picture. Among them were incident reports describing inmates cutting their wrists with broken razors, swallowing pieces of metal, and smashing their heads against walls. One report described an inmate who bit off his own finger and swallowed it. Another described a man who gouged out his eyes during a psychotic break. Medical logs showed that many of these inmates had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or severe PTSD before arriving at ADX. Yet once inside, they were often stripped of medication, denied therapy, and placed in long-term solitary confinement. The Bureau defended its actions by arguing that these inmates were violent and manipulative, too dangerous for hospitals or regular prisons. But the documents told a different story. Some of these men had no history of violence inside the prison system. Their only crime was mental illness in a place that saw vulnerability as a threat. One psychologist who worked briefly at ADX testified anonymously, stating, "We weren't treating them. We were observing them fall apart." The system was designed to contain, not to heal. The turning point. As the Baycoat case gained national attention, pressure mounted from journalists, lawmakers, and human rights groups. Reporters from the New York Times and the Denver Post began publishing detailed investigations exposing what was happening behind the walls. The descriptions horrified the public: men pacing endlessly in their 7 by 12-foot cells. Lights kept on 24 hours a day. Recreation cages the size of parking spaces. Inmates denied phone calls to family for years. One former warden, Robert Hood, broke his silence in a 2013 interview, saying, "ADX is not built for humanity. It's built for control." The phrase stuck. By the time the case reached mediation in 2015, the Bureau of Prisons had little choice but to negotiate. For the first time in its history, it acknowledged, publicly and legally, that mentally ill inmates had been held in conditions that could exacerbate their suffering. The government agreed to a historic settlement, promising sweeping changes to how it managed mental health in high-security prisons. The settlement. The Baycoat settlement did not close ADX Florence, but it forced the Bureau to confront the human damage within its own creation. Key provisions included the transfer of severely mentally ill inmates out of ADX to federal medical centers like Springfield, Missouri, and Butner, North Carolina. The establishment of a residential mental health treatment unit within ADX for those requiring long-term care but deemed too dangerous to move. Mandatory mental health screenings and quarterly evaluations for all inmates. Staff training on recognizing and responding to psychological distress. A new monitoring committee to ensure compliance and oversight. Though the Bureau never admitted wrongdoing, the settlement marked a turning point. For the first time, Florence's impenetrable system had been forced to bend. The human faces behind the case. The men who triggered the lawsuit became unlikely symbols of resistance. Jack Powers, once dismissed as unstable, became a key witness. His detailed letters describing hallucinations and self-harm exposed the system's darkest corners. After years in solitary, he was eventually transferred to a lower security facility and later released. His mental scars, however, never faded. In an interview, he said, "People think ADX is about punishment. It's not. It's about forgetting. They build walls high enough to make the world forget you ever existed." Troy Anderson, the lead plaintiff, continued to advocate for prison reform from inside. Despite ongoing psychological struggles, his courage reshaped policy that had seemed untouchable for 2 decades. Their fight was not for freedom, but for recognition, the simple acknowledgement that suffering behind walls still counts as human. The Bureau's response. Inside the Bureau of Prisons, reactions were mixed. Some officials viewed the settlement as a humiliation, a sign that public pressure could weaken federal authority. Others saw it as overdue accountability. In internal memos later obtained by journalists, one senior official wrote, "ADX must evolve. The facility cannot maintain credibility if it becomes synonymous with cruelty." Following the settlement, the Bureau began implementing incremental reforms. Mental health professionals were hired. A dedicated psychiatric unit was established. The step-down program was expanded to include psychological counseling. Yet, despite these changes, the fundamental structure of ADX, total isolation, remained intact. The reforms addressed symptoms, not causes. A former staff psychologist summed it up, "We built a better version of the same machine." Other lawsuits, same story. Baycoat was only the beginning. It inspired a wave of litigation challenging solitary confinement across the United States. In Ashker v. Governor of California, 2015, inmates at Pelican Bay State Prison successfully argued that indefinite solitary confinement constituted cruel and unusual punishment. The case led to major policy reforms in California. Federal lawsuits followed in Illinois, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, each citing the Baycoat precedent as evidence that isolation, when prolonged, becomes psychological torture. Even international courts began referencing ADX Florence as the benchmark for extreme isolation. In 2012, the European Court of Human Rights initially blocked the extradition of several terrorism suspects to the U.S., questioning whether confinement at ADX would violate human rights. Only after assurances of humane treatment did the extraditions proceed. In effect, ADX Florence, once seen as America's greatest prison triumph, had become its most controversial export. A warden's dilemma. Robert Hood, the former ADX warden who later spoke publicly, became one of the system's most unexpected critics. He had once enforced its rules without hesitation. But after retirement, he began reflecting on the moral cost. In an interview with 60 Minutes, he said, "When I walked those corridors, I believed I was keeping America safe. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized we were also burying men alive." He recalled visiting an inmate who hadn't spoken in 6 years. "I looked into his eyes," Hood said, "and it was like looking into a mirror that didn't reflect anything back." His words carried weight because they came from inside the machine. He wasn't an activist or a politician. He was the man who had once called ADX a model of order. By admitting its flaws, he validated what prisoners had been saying for decades. The legacy of Baycoat. Years after the settlement, the ripple effects of Baycoat v. BOP continue to shape policy and perception. The Bureau now publicly emphasizes rehabilitation, even in high-security environments. Its annual reports reference mental wellness and behavioral stability, terms once absent from the vocabulary of supermax prisons. But beneath the new language, the core remains unchanged. ADX still operates under the same architectural philosophy: isolation as safety, silence as order. Human rights experts argue that the settlement, while historic, did not go far enough. They didn't dismantle the machine, said one observer. They just put padding on the gears. Yet even limited change matters. For the men still inside, small cracks in the wall can mean survival. The lawsuit didn't close ADX Florence, but it proved it could bleed. Echoes from the inside. Today, the names of the Baycoat plaintiffs rarely appear in public discussion. Their stories fade in the noise of newer scandals and shifting political climates. But inside ADX, their legacy lingers. Inmates now receive mental health screenings upon arrival. Some are transferred before breaking. Others are offered therapy, however limited. The staff speak in gentler tones, their routines slightly less mechanical. And somewhere in a control room, an officer still watches the monitors, row after row of small, windowless cells. The silence is still there. The system still hums. But once in a while, a voice breaks through, a letter, a report, a lawsuit, reminding the world that no fortress, no matter how silent, can bury truth forever. The price of a perfect prison. ADX Florence was designed to make America feel safe, to guarantee that its most dangerous men could never again harm the world. It succeeded. But as the lawsuits revealed, safety and humanity often stand on opposite sides of the same wall. In chasing one, the nation nearly erased the other. The courts called it reform. The Bureau called it progress. The inmates called it survival. Whatever the name, the meaning is the same. Even the strongest fortress eventually hears the echoes of its own conscience. And in Florence, those echoes still bounce between the walls, the whispers of men who proved that silence, when forced too long, always finds a way to speak. The guards behind the glass. Every fortress has its builders, its watchmen, and its ghosts. At ADX Florence, the watchmen become both. Behind the walls of the most secure prison in America, hundreds of men and women walk the same sterile corridors as the inmates they guard. They carry keys, radios, and the quiet burden of working in a place that never sleeps and never forgives. The world knows the names of the prisoners: Kaczynski, Youssef, El Chapo, but not the names of those who watch them. The officers of ADX live by a code of silence just as binding as the one imposed on their captives. They are the unseen operators of the machine, enforcing order in a world built on isolation. But as years turn to decades, the walls begin to shape everyone inside them, prisoner and guard alike. The human wall. To work at ADX Florence is to step into a machine that demands perfection. Every movement, every word, every gesture is regulated. Guards must submit to psychological screening, polygraph tests, and intensive training in restraint techniques and tactical awareness. They patrol the same paths each day, sterile corridors that echo with the hum of air filtration and the faint buzz of fluorescent light. They wear body armor under their uniforms, carry pepper spray and radios, and follow protocols so rigid that deviation can end careers. A former correctional officer, speaking anonymously to the Marshall Project, described the environment as a war zone without a war. He said, "You go in there knowing that everyone you're guarding has nothing left to lose. So you learn to walk like a ghost, quiet, fast, predictable. The less you exist, the safer you are." The officers are trained not to make eye contact with inmates unless necessary, not to respond to provocation, not to show emotion. Human connection, even a moment of empathy, can be interpreted as weakness. Every decision, from opening a cell door to handing over a meal, is recorded. The system leaves no room for trust. "You stop thinking in terms of people," said another guard. "You start thinking in terms of movement. How to move the inmate, how to move yourself, how to move the day along." For the Bureau of Prisons, this efficiency is a triumph. For the humans inside the uniform, it's a slow disassembly of identity. eyes that never close. The control rooms of ADX are the prison's brain, dimly lit chambers lined with monitors, switches, and control panels. From there, a handful of officers oversee every unit, watching the inmates through dozens of cameras. They can open and close cell doors remotely, activate lights, and trigger lockdowns with the press of a button. They are both present and invisible, omnipotent but detached. A retired guard once described his shift as watching men breathe for 8 hours straight. He said the hardest part wasn't the danger, but the monotony. You start counting their movements. You know when a guy is going to stand up before he does. You learn their rhythms, their habits, their breakdowns. The job becomes hypnotic. Officers begin to anticipate behaviors like patterns in a video loop. Over time, the distinction between observation and participation fades. They don't just guard the inmates, they mirror them. The cameras never blink, and neither can the guards. Every mistake is recorded. Every hesitation is documented. When something goes wrong, a fight, a suicide attempt, a malfunction, the footage becomes evidence, the officer's every move replayed frame by frame. One officer recalled watching a suicide attempt live on camera, but being too far to intervene in time. By the time we got there, he was gone, he said. We watched it happen in silence. That's the part that sticks, the silence. The weight of silence. Most people imagine prison work as loud, chaotic, and violent. ADX is the opposite. It is quiet, unnaturally so. Guards walk miles of corridor each day without hearing a single voice. The inmates rarely speak. The doors open and close with hydraulic precision. The air hums. That silence, repeated year after year, begins to eat away at the mind. Former Warden Robert Hood described it as psychological compression. You're managing a facility that runs on silence and fear, he said. Eventually, that silence starts managing you. Officers develop coping mechanisms. Some listen to music through earpieces after work, others turn to alcohol or isolation. Divorce rates are high. Mental health issues are common. But few talk about it. The culture of stoicism runs deep. A correctional counselor once told the Denver Post, "We don't talk about stress. You deal with it. You shut up and come back tomorrow." Inside ADX, even empathy is dangerous. Guards are taught not to personalize their work, not to see inmates as victims or monsters, but as subjects of management. Yet empathy always finds cracks. Some officers admit feeling pity for older inmates, men who have lost decades to the system. Others say they sometimes linger outside a cell just to hear a voice, any voice, break the monotony. You tell yourself it's for security, one said. But really, you just want to remember what talking feels like. Training for perfection. New recruits to ADX undergo one of the most intense training regimens in the federal system. They learn riot control, tactical extraction, handcuffing procedures, and mental conditioning. The goal isn't just physical readiness, it's psychological transformation. They are told from day one, this is not a normal prison. They are warned that ADX inmates will study them, manipulate them, and exploit every weakness. Guards are shown videos of past incidents where officers were attacked in other facilities. They are told never to relax, never to trust, and never to believe that quiet means safety. But what training doesn't prepare them for is the monotony, the slow, grinding routine of control. A former officer recalled, "You spend years enforcing the same motions. Same doors, same counts, same voices. The danger isn't violence. It's forgetting who you are when you leave the gate." Over time, the training becomes instinct. Officers begin operating like parts of a system, reacting without thought. The line between vigilance and automation blurs. The moral gray zone. For many guards, the hardest part of the job isn't fear or fatigue, it's morality. Most came into law enforcement believing in justice, in punishment balanced by fairness. But ADX isn't about fairness, it's about containment. Guards enforce policies they sometimes don't agree with: extended solitary confinement, communication bans, forced restraint checks. Some wrestle with guilt. Others rationalize. A few detach completely. An anonymous officer once said, "You tell yourself it's not your job to judge. You're just following policy." But when you see a man talking to the wall for the 100th day, You start asking questions you can't afford to answer. Others take pride in the order. To them, ADX represents victory, proof that chaos can be controlled. "We don't punish people here," one sergeant told 60 Minutes. "We protect the country from them." Both statements are true. That's what makes ADX so haunting. It blurs the line between justice and endurance, between protecting and destroying. Mental health behind the badge. If inmates inside ADX show the scars of isolation, so do the people guarding them. Studies conducted on correctional staff in supermax facilities show high rates of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and emotional numbing. The constant exposure to silence, control, and tension creates a low-grade trauma that never fully dissipates. Many officers carry the effects home. Spouses describe emotional distance, sleeplessness, and bursts of anger. Children talk about parents who sit silently at dinner, unable to transition from the stillness of work to the noise of family life. ADX changes you. One former officer confessed. You start craving silence. You can't handle crowds or music. The noise feels wrong. Psychologists call this institutional absorption, when individuals adopt the psychological environment of the place they work. In ADX, that means becoming as controlled and detached as the prison itself. A long-serving counselor put it bluntly: you become one of the walls. The few who speak out. Very few officers ever speak publicly about their experiences. The Bureau of Prisons discourages it, citing security concerns. But the rare ones who do reveal a haunting pattern, pride mixed with remorse. Robert Hood remains the most prominent voice among them. As warden from 2002 to 2005, he oversaw both the harshest security measures and the earliest reform discussions. He later described the contradiction as unbearable. "I ran the cleanest, most secure prison in the country," he said, "and every day I wondered if I was losing my soul doing it." Others echo that sentiment. One guard, interviewed anonymously after retirement, said, "You go in there thinking you're keeping people safe. But after a while, you realize you're keeping people silent, including yourself." The bonds no one admits despite the rules forbidding emotional connection, invisible bonds sometimes form between guards and inmates. After years of daily interaction, even through steel doors, officers begin recognizing patterns of behavior: who's deteriorating, who's calm, who's pretending. Some develop an unspoken understanding, small gestures of mutual recognition. A guard might place a meal tray gently for an inmate having a rough day. An inmate might nod in acknowledgement. No words, just brief human exchange, the only kind allowed. These moments are never documented, but they matter. They remind both sides that beneath the roles of warden and prisoner, they are still human beings sharing the same oppressive silence. When the guards break. There have been rare but significant incidents where the silence breaks, when guards themselves become victims of the system they maintain. In 2009, a veteran officer at ADX took his own life. Colleagues later said he had struggled with depression and stress, but refused to seek help, fearing it would be seen as weakness. His death went largely unreported outside Colorado, but inside the Bureau, it sent shockwaves. Another guard suffered a breakdown after witnessing multiple suicides in the same unit. He stopped coming to work, one coworker recalled. He said he couldn't watch people disappear anymore. These events prompted internal discussions about staff mental health, but few structural changes. The culture of silence remained. Two sides of the same wall. The tragedy of ADX is that its system doesn't differentiate between those it confines and those it employs. Both live by the same rules: isolation, control, and emotional restraint. The inmates are sentenced to silence by law. The guards choose it every morning when they walk through the gates. For the officers, the work becomes identity. Leaving it feels impossible. "The outside world moves too fast," said one retired sergeant. "Here, everything makes sense. Out there, it's chaos." But the longer they stay, the more the line blurs. Guards begin to mirror the inmates, measured, distant, numb. The same architecture that breaks one side shapes the other. In the end, ADX Florence doesn't just imprison its inmates. It imprisons everyone inside it. The invisible toll. When most people imagine a prison, they think of bars and chains. But at ADX, the real shackles are invisible, woven into the routines of those who enforce them. Officers retire with pensions, medals, and commendations, but many also carry memories they never discuss. Some avoid interviews. Others spend their lives defending the system that shaped them, unable or unwilling to confront what it cost. The silence that defines ADX doesn't end at the gate. It follows its workers home, into their marriages, their dreams, their solitude. A retired captain put it best: the inmates do years in cells. We do years in uniforms. It's the same sentence, just different walls. A mirror made of concrete. In the mythology of ADX Florence, the inmates are the villains, the guards the heroes, and the prison the fortress that keeps good and evil apart. But the reality is murkier. The walls don't separate morality, they reflect it. The guards behind the glass are both protectors and prisoners. They maintain order in a place that erases humanity, while slowly losing pieces of their own. The silence that once represented power now represents cost, a toll paid in unseen emotion, in dreams filled with echoing corridors and flickering lights. As one officer wrote upon retiring after 20 years of service, you don't leave ADX when you walk out the door. It stays with you, in the way you move, in the way you think, in the way silence sounds louder than any noise. And in that single confession lies the final irony of America's most secure prison, that those who built it and those who live inside it are not opposites. They are reflections of each other, bound forever by the same walls, breathing the same still air, haunted by the same silence. Public outcry and global condemnation. For years, the silence surrounding ADX Florence was mistaken for success. No riots, no escapes, no fires, no chaos. In the public eye, that meant perfection. But silence is deceptive. It hides, it delays, it conceals. And eventually, it cracks. By the mid-2010s, the fortress in the Colorado desert, once celebrated as the pinnacle of American correctional engineering, was beginning to face a reckoning. The lawsuits had revealed its human cost. Journalists had peeled back parts of its myth. And the world, watching from outside, began asking a question that America had avoided for decades. Can a nation built on liberty justify a place designed to erase the human spirit? The world starts watching in 2011 as the Baycote v. Bureau of Prisons case gained traction. Foreign journalists began describing ADX Florence in chilling terms. British outlets called it the silent prison. The French newspaper Le Monde referred to it as Le Tombeau Vivant, the living tomb. And in Germany, human rights advocates began comparing it to psychological torture facilities documented under authoritarian regimes. These were not exaggerations. Reports from inside Florence matched findings by international experts on sensory deprivation. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez, publicly declared that prolonged solitary confinement beyond 15 days constitutes cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. At ADX, 15 days was a blink. Many prisoners had been there for 15 years. By 2012, the European Court of Human Rights had taken notice. When the U.S. government sought to extradite terrorism suspects from the United Kingdom, men accused of plotting bombings and assassinations, their lawyers argued that sending them to ADX would violate international human rights law. For the first time in history, an American prison became a global legal obstacle. The extradition debate in July 2012, the case Babar Ahmad and others v. the United Kingdom reached the European Court of Human Rights. The defendants, including Babar Ahmad, Syed Talha Hassan, and Abu Hamza al-Masri, were accused of supporting terrorism and conspiring with al-Qaeda affiliates. Their attorneys argued that if extradited to the United States, they would likely be confined at ADX Florence under Special Administrative Measures, SAMs, and that such conditions amounted to inhuman treatment. The British public was divided. Some saw the argument as absurd. Why should terrorists be spared discomfort? Others saw something deeper, a moral challenge to American justice itself. During hearings, experts testified that ADX conditions could cause irreversible psychiatric damage. They cited cases of inmates losing speech, self-harming, and hallucinating voices after years of isolation. The United States responded with diplomatic precision, assuring the court that ADX was humane, regulated, and compliant with medical standards. They argued that the step-down program offered inmates a clear path to lesser restrictions and eventual social reintegration. After months of deliberation, the court ruled in favor of extradition, but only after accepting U.S. guarantees that the men would not face indefinite or inescapable isolation. It was a narrow victory for Washington, one achieved not through transparency, but through carefully worded promises. The amnesty reports the decision did not end the controversy. In 2014, Amnesty International published its most detailed report yet, Entombed: Isolation in the U.S. Federal Prison System. It described ADX Florence as a deeply troubling example of excessive isolation, citing accounts of inmates denied medical treatment, contact with family, or meaningful rehabilitation opportunities. The report included haunting testimonies. "I haven't touched another human in 10 years. I talk to the walls because they're the only ones that answer. You don't serve time here. Time serves you." Amnesty's investigators called for an immediate end to prolonged solitary confinement and urged the U.S. to comply with international standards, including the U.N.'s Mandela Rules, which define solitary confinement beyond 15 days as a human rights violation. The Bureau of Prisons dismissed the report as subjective and insisted that ADX remained safe, secure, and constitutional. But the damage to its reputation was done. The American debate. Inside the United States, a rare bipartisan conversation began to take shape. For decades, both political parties had supported the supermax model as a symbol of strength, proof that America could control even its most dangerous enemies. But after the Baycoat settlement and Amnesty's revelations, that certainty began to crumble. Senators and governors who had once championed tough on crime policies started questioning the ethics and cost of permanent isolation. In 2015, then President Barack Obama became the first U.S. leader to publicly address the issue of solitary confinement, stating, "It's not smart justice. It's not humane. And it doesn't make us safer." The Department of Justice launched a review of federal confinement policies, leading to limited reforms, including restrictions on the use of solitary confinement for juveniles and the mentally ill. While these changes did not directly alter ADX Florence, they signaled a shift in tone. America was finally admitting that its most secure prison carried a moral shadow. The cost of perfection. As scrutiny intensified, journalists began investigating the economics of ADX. The findings were staggering. Operating a supermax cell costs roughly $78,000 per year, nearly triple the cost of housing an inmate in a standard federal prison. The facility requires advanced technology, constant maintenance, and heavily trained staff. Taxpayers were paying millions to maintain a place that produced no rehabilitated inmates, no vocational programs, and no reintegration, only silence. Critics began calling ADX a monument to fear, arguing that it existed more to reassure the public than to serve justice. "The American people are paying to keep men invisible," wrote journalist Shane Bauer, who had himself been held in solitary confinement as a political prisoner in Iran before touring U.S. prisons. "What we do to them says less about their crimes and more about our comfort with cruelty." Families on the outside. As media coverage expanded, families of ADX inmates began to speak publicly for the first time. Mothers, wives, and children who had spent years writing unanswered letters or traveling thousands of miles for brief, glass-separated visits shared their pain. One woman, whose husband had been in ADX for over a decade, said, "I don't know if he's alive until I get a letter. Sometimes months go by. I just pray the silence isn't permanent." A mother whose son was serving life for a violent crime described visiting him in the prison's non-contact room. "He looks through me, not at me. His eyes move, but I can tell he's still in that cell, even when he's with me." Their stories reframed the narrative. ADX wasn't just a facility. It was a ripple of pain extending far beyond Colorado's fences, breaking families who had already lost everything once. The international condemnation grows. As the 2020s began, global condemnation intensified. The United Nations Human Rights Committee, The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and Human Rights Watch all issued statements urging the United States to reform or close facilities using prolonged isolation. The UN reiterated that solitary confinement in excess of 15 days should be prohibited. At ADX, dozens of inmates had spent over a decade in isolation. Even allies began questioning American credibility. When U.S. diplomats criticized other nations for human rights violations, foreign leaders pointed back at Florence. How? One European delegate asked during a UN assembly, "Can the nation that built ADX Florence speak of dignity?" The irony was undeniable. The same country that condemned secret prisons abroad operated one of the world's most secretive facilities at home, and did so proudly. The Bureau of Prisons defends its legacy. Publicly, the Bureau of Prisons remained unyielding. In press statements and congressional hearings, officials argued that ADX Florence was a necessary tool for national security. They pointed to the inmates' crimes: mass murder, terrorism, espionage, cartel violence. They reminded the public that ADX had prevented countless deaths by keeping the nation's most dangerous individuals in total control. "The system works," one official said bluntly. "Not one person has ever escaped from Florence." To many Americans, that was enough. In an age of fear, from 9/11 to mass shootings, the idea of an unbreakable prison provided comfort. But comfort built on silence is fragile. Even some within the Bureau began questioning whether success justified the moral cost. A senior staff psychologist said privately, "You can build a perfect cage, but it still holds people." The divided nation. The national debate over ADX Florence became a mirror for America's larger struggle with justice. To some, the prison symbolized strength, a testament to order in a chaotic world. To others, it symbolized failure, proof that America's pursuit of safety had crossed into cruelty. The arguments fell along familiar lines: security versus humanity, control versus compassion, punishment versus reform. But beneath the politics, one truth remained: ADX was working exactly as designed. No one escaped. No one rebelled. No one recovered. Cultural reflections. As ADX entered the public consciousness, it began appearing in documentaries, books, and films. From Netflix's Inside the World's Toughest Prisons to investigative series by Vice News and The Marshall Project, viewers were shown glimpses of sterile cells, windowless corridors, and voices trembling through thick glass. Pop culture, always fascinated by extremes, turned ADX into both a horror story and a metaphor, the physical embodiment of a system obsessed with control. Even artists and musicians began referencing the supermax in lyrics and performances. For some, it represented power; for others, punishment beyond redemption. The irony was not lost. A place designed to erase people had become one of the most talked about prisons on Earth. The world questions justice. In 2022, on the 30th anniversary of ADX Florence's construction, The Washington Post published a feature titled "The Prison That America Forgot to Question." It quoted wardens, inmates' families, and human rights experts. One line captured the contradiction perfectly: ADX has achieved what it promised: perfect control. The question is whether perfection is something a democracy should ever aspire to. By then, more than 400 men had passed through ADX's gates. Some had been transferred. Some had died. None had truly lived free again. The moral reckoning. As more countries began phasing out or restricting solitary confinement, America's adherence to the supermax model began to look archaic. Norway, Denmark, and Germany had adopted human dignity approaches to incarceration, emphasizing rehabilitation over punishment. In contrast, the United States still relied on places like Florence to symbolize justice. Critics argued that ADX reflected not strength, but fear, the fear of losing control in a world that demands certainty. Dr. Craig Haney, a renowned psychologist who studied the prison extensively, summarized it best: ADX Florence is the end of a line, not just for prisoners, but for a philosophy. It's what happens when a society stops believing people can change. Echoes of change. Despite its defenders, the winds of reform are gathering. New lawsuits continue to challenge the legality of prolonged isolation. Legislators are quietly discussing limits on solitary confinement. Younger Americans, more exposed to documentaries and digital activism, are less accepting of absolute punishment. Yet change is slow. The walls of Florence still stand, unyielding, their watchtowers piercing the Colorado sky. The lights still hum. The cameras still blink. The silence still rules. But outside, the world is talking. And talk, for a place built on silence, is the beginning of collapse. The judgment of history. Every empire builds monuments to its fears. For ancient Rome, it was the Colosseum. For modern America, it may well be ADX Florence, a structure that contains the bodies of the guilty and the conscience of a nation. The world has already rendered its verdict. Isolation on this scale is inhuman. Whether America will ever agree remains uncertain. But history is not written by those who stay silent. And somewhere between the lawsuits, the families, and the whispers of reform, the truth is emerging that a society's strength is not measured by how tightly it can cage its enemies, but by how much humanity it can preserve while doing so. ADX Florence remains unbroken, but its myth of perfection is beginning to fracture. And as cracks spread through the silence, the world waits for the moment when America finally listens to the sound of its own conscience echoing back from the walls it built. The future of supermax justice. The walls of ADX Florence still rise from the Colorado desert like a monument to control, steel, concrete, and silence stretching endlessly beneath the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. For 3 decades, this fortress has stood as the endpoint of the American penal system, the place where justice is measured not in years, but in isolation. Yet even fortresses cannot outlast the questions that built them. And as America changes, the future of ADX, and of supermax prisons themselves, is being forced into the light. A machine built for a past era. When ADX opened in 1994, the United States was in the grip of fear. The crack epidemic, gang wars, and the Oklahoma City bombing had shaken national confidence in law and order. Congress poured billions into new prisons, and the public demanded harsher punishment. ADX was the answer, a perfect cage for the worst of the worst. It wasn't designed for rehabilitation or redemption. It was designed to end stories. But the country that built ADX is not the same country that exists now. The fear-driven policies of the 1990s have begun to lose their moral and political weight. Studies have shown that mass incarceration failed to deliver long-term safety and instead deepened cycles of poverty and mental illness. Even some architects of the supermax era now admit regret. One former Bureau of Prisons official said quietly, "We built a monument to control and called it justice. We mistook silence for peace." ADX Florence, once the symbol of national strength, now stands as a relic of an ideology the world is beginning to outgrow. Technology and the new face of control. The next generation of prison design looks different. Artificial intelligence, biometric surveillance, and behavior-predicting algorithms are replacing many of the physical and psychological controls that define the supermax model. In experimental facilities, inmate behavior is tracked by sensors that detect stress levels, heart rate changes, and even micro-expressions. Automated systems analyze speech for signs of aggression. To some, this is progress, control without cruelty. To others, it's a new form of invisible oppression. A criminologist from Stanford University summarized it best: ADX controlled the body. The next generation of prisons will control the mind. Even within ADX, technology has begun to evolve. The control rooms now use advanced facial recognition and data analytics. Every inmate's movement, communication, and biometric signature is monitored. The human guards, once the eyes of the prison, are becoming secondary to machines. It's a haunting evolution. The fortress that once symbolized total control is slowly being absorbed into a larger, digital architecture of surveillance that reaches far beyond its walls. A shift in consciousness. Outside the wire, public attitudes toward punishment are shifting. The rise of social media and independent journalism has eroded the invisibility that once protected prisons like ADX. A new generation of Americans, exposed to documentaries, leaked letters, and inmate testimonies, is questioning whether absolute isolation has any place in a democratic society. In 2021, a Pew Research Center survey found that nearly 70% of Americans support reducing or eliminating long-term solitary confinement. The language of reform, once dismissed as radical, is becoming mainstream. Politicians, too, are changing tone. Legislation introduced in several states seeks to cap solitary confinement at 15 or 30 days, aligning with the United Nations Mandela rules. While federal facilities like ADX remain exempt, the tide is turning. The same cultural forces that once glorified lock them up are now asking, what happens after we do? Inside the Bureau's quiet reassessment within the Bureau of Prisons, reform has become a word spoken carefully but increasingly often. After the Baycoat lawsuit and years of public scrutiny, internal task forces began reviewing mental health policies, communication systems, and the step-down program. Small pilot projects tested new therapy modules and reduced isolation units. Yet the Bureau faces a paradox. If it admits that prolonged isolation is inhumane, it undermines the very foundation of ADX. One internal memo, leaked in 2022, summarized the dilemma bluntly. The ADX model is our most efficient form of high-security control. Replacing it means redesigning the entire federal system. In other words, reforming ADX isn't just about one prison. It's about rethinking what America believes prisons are for. The ghosts of the past. Even as reforms inch forward, the ghosts of ADX's past still haunt its legacy. The men who built the supermax system, the wardens, architects, and policymakers, are now being re-examined through a new moral lens. Documentaries and exposés portray them not as heroes of security, but as participants in a national overreach born of fear. Former Warden Robert Hood, once the face of Florence's success, now spends his retirement speaking at universities about the dangers of total isolation. He often begins his talks with a confession: "We thought we were building safety. What we built was silence." His words resonate with younger audiences, many of whom see the supermax not as progress, but as a warning, a reminder of how far justice can stray when fear writes the blueprint. Reform from the inside. Surprisingly, some of the loudest calls for change now come from inside the system. Younger correctional officers, psychologists, and program managers are pushing for more rehabilitative methods. They've seen the mental toll that isolation takes not only on inmates, but on staff. A new generation of wardens has begun experimenting with structured communication programs, allowing certain inmates limited social interaction under strict supervision. Others have introduced education, exercise, and virtual visitation systems to reduce psychological strain. The changes are incremental, but symbolically powerful. For the first time, the word rehabilitation has appeared in ADX's internal training materials. It's a fragile sign of progress, a flicker of humanity inside a machine designed to extinguish it. Global influence and backlash. Ironically, the design principles of ADX Florence have already been exported worldwide. Supermax-style facilities now exist in Brazil, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Russia, and China, many modeled directly on the Florence blueprint. Some use the same architectural philosophy, control through isolation. Others use Florence's operational protocols almost verbatim. Human rights organizations warn that America's example has legitimized extreme confinement globally. When the United States defends ADX as necessary and humane, it gives cover to regimes that use similar methods with far less oversight. "The world copies what America tolerates," said one Amnesty investigator. And for 30 years, America has tolerated silence. Now, as the global human rights movement accelerates, the United States faces a crossroads: either lead reform or remain the architect of a model the world increasingly condemns. The human question. The core question remains the same as it was in 1994. Can you control evil without destroying what makes people human? For some, the answer is still yes. They point to terrorists, serial killers, and gang leaders whose crimes defy empathy. They argue that places like ADX exist to protect society, not to comfort the guilty. But psychologists and reformers insist that even the most dangerous humans remain human, and that isolation erodes not just the inmate, but the system that inflicts it. Dr. Stuart Gracian, a leading researcher on solitary confinement, described it as a form of psychological lobotomy. He warned that when a state deliberately breaks the minds of its prisoners, it crosses from justice into cruelty. That argument is no longer academic, it's cultural. Across social platforms, podcasts, and films, people are asking, if punishment destroys humanity, does it still serve justice? The future in motion. A slow transformation is already underway. In 2023, the Federal Bureau of Prisons announced the expansion of residential mental health units, RMHUs, in multiple high-security facilities, including plans to retrofit parts of ADX Florence itself. The new units, modeled on the step-down concept but focused on therapy and reintegration, aim to provide pathways towards stability. Critics call it cosmetic. Supporters call it historic. Either way, it's movement, the first cracks in a system long defined by stillness. Some inmates have already transferred into hybrid programs allowing brief contact, limited recreation, and monitored group discussions. For men who once went years without another voice, even 5 minutes of conversation feels revolutionary. Public memory and the myth of the supermax as Florence ages, it is becoming less a facility and more a symbol, a story America tells itself about control. Documentaries, podcasts, and investigative series continue to revisit its legend. The Alcatraz of the Rockies, the Tomb of Silence, America's end of the line. Each one reshapes how the public remembers it. The narrative is evolving from one of pride to one of introspection. What was once seen as justice now reads like warning. For historians and future criminologists, ADX Florence may come to represent the end of an era, the last gasp of an industrial-age punishment philosophy in a world moving towards psychological and technological forms of control. The unfinished reckoning. But the reckoning is not complete. There are still men inside ADX who have spent 20 years in near-total isolation. There are still lawsuits pending, still families waiting for calls that never come, still guards pacing the same corridors, aging alongside the walls. And there is still a nation that benefits from their silence, a public that finds comfort in not having to think about them. The future of supermax justice depends not only on policy or technology, but on whether society itself is willing to confront what these places represent, the desire to forget. To dismantle ADX would mean to remember, to face the faces behind the walls, to accept that control has a cost, and that the cost has a human name. Beyond the walls. Imagine, for a moment, that the gates of ADX Florence were opened, not in chaos, but in reform. Imagine the cells repurposed into treatment centers, education spaces, or archives documenting the dark lessons of mass incarceration. This vision may seem idealistic, even naive. But so once did the idea of abolishing debtors' prisons, or ending child labor, or granting prisoners basic rights. Every moral evolution begins as heresy. In the future, historians may walk the corridors of Florence as one walks through a museum, studying how fear built walls and how courage dismantled them. Perhaps one day, the hum of fluorescent light will give way to the sound of conversation, not between guard and inmate, but between generations asking, how did this happen? And maybe the answer will come, quiet but undeniable, because we believe control was safer than compassion. The story of ADX Florence is not just the story of a prison. It is the story of America's relationship with fear, and what it becomes willing to sacrifice in the name of safety. Every nation has its monuments. Some are built to celebrate freedom. Others are built to contain what freedom fears. Florence is the latter, a monument not to justice, but to its limits. The question for the future is not whether ADX can change, but whether the country that built it can. Because as long as the lights stay on in that silent fortress, America must live with the echo of its own creation, a voice whispering through concrete and steel, reminding the world that no nation can truly call itself free while it keeps its conscience locked away.